I just wanted to say that, first of all, I'm Anthony Riddle. I'm the Director of Community Media here. And one of the reasons that we're really happy about Sky putting these together is because if you picture everybody in this room working in media, then there's like a set amount of knowledge that everybody has when you add everybody together. And that if we can pour more knowledge into the room, then the level of knowledge in the whole room rises and the capability of everybody in the room rises. And so we're really glad to have people who are really knowledgeable about what they do come in and talk to you about what they do, because we just feel like, this is not a linear world anymore. This is a nonlinear world, and you have to really have a wide breadth of understanding of what you're doing in order to be accomplished. So this is one of the ways that we try to do it. I'm going to hand it over to Sky McLeod, our associate director for adult education, and let him introduce the program. But thank you all for coming.
Hi, my name is Sky McLeod. I'm the Associate Director for Media Education. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you for putting up with all the technical difficulties. That's part of working in media, is knowing to put batteries in the remote control. So Ken Olshansky is a television writer and producer with a broad range of comedy, family, and animated programming credits. Currently a supervising producer at CNN. Ken has worked at Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, and at media companies including Granada, Scholastic Entertainment, and Sony Wonder. As a development and production executive, he's overseen a diverse slate of award-winning programming, from Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect to PBS preschool series Clifford's Puppy Days, which I love because I have a 2-year-old, and Adult Swim's cult favorite home movies. Ken began his entertainment career at Chicago's Second City improvisational theater company. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Ken Olshansky for our media talk. There you go, Ken.
Thank you so much, Sky, and thank you, Anthony. I think the theme tonight of what I wanted to say is that in media professions, there's no straight path or no predictable path between where you start, where you end up, what you want to do, and what you end up doing. And so what I wanted to do, Sky sort of ran through some of what I've done, some of my credits, and I kind of want to connect the dots a little bit and explain how it is that somebody who oversaw the production of Clifford's Puppy Days would be working at CNN. So, I mean, I think just to sort of take a step back, journalism is, I'm not actually a journalist. I really consider myself a TV producer working in cable news, but it's a journalistic environment. And most of the people there took a fairly predictable path. They worked on newspapers in high school and in college. A lot of them were journalism majors, either undergraduate or graduate. A lot of them got internships at news organizations, print or digital or TV. It's still a field where you can take a fairly straight path from, sort of aspiring as a student to join the profession to becoming a professional. I didn't do any of that. And instead, I did this.
Before there was high, there was no 24-hour TV comedy network. Before there was high, it was hard to find comedy at 10 o'clock at night, mainly cop shows. There was no place to go for almost every show ever made by MTM. Meow. Before there was high, my cable box seemed empty somehow. Ha.
Yeah, that's Mel Torme. So that was a promo that I wrote for a cable network that's been out of business for almost 25 years. It was called Ha, and it was sort of a precursor to Comedy Central. Comedy Central is the result of a merger between Ha and another comedy channel called the Comedy Channel. And I got to Ha because when I came to New York, I was primarily focused on comedy. I was a comedy writer and a comedy performer, and most of my first jobs were comedy writing jobs. A lot of freelance writing for a lot of the local, cable networks. I sort of ended up at Ha and then Comedy Central on the basis of that work. So rather than starting my, career at CNN in my high school newspaper or getting a journalism degree from, Columbia or NYU or Missouri, I started at the Second City, which is the improvisational theater in Chicago. And it's an amazing comedy institution. It's a place that's produced a lot of the comedy talent that, really shapes our culture from the earliest days with Alan Arkin and Alan Alda, or actually even originally Nichols and May, and then through, John Belushi and Bill Murray, and more recently Tina Fey and Stephen Colbert. Second City has a really focused and well-developed approach to comedy that it sort of was, for me, that was graduate school. I learned a lot there that has traveled with me through a lot of different roles in media and production business, and that I still draw on extensively in the work that I'm doing now. And so that's really kind of what I'm hoping to do, is to explain to you how someone could get from improvising at Second City to producing at CNN. It starts with some very basic lessons there, and I'll go through some of them in more detail, but the main thing is that when you improvise, the first thing that you need to do as an improviser is to pay attention to what's going around you in the world. You need to take it in, you need to process it, you need to try to understand what motivates people, you need to try to understand why people do the things that they do. All of these are critical skills as a news producer. And the way that one of the really great teacher and directors at Second City was this guy named Del Close, and the way that he summed it up was a good improviser is a good human. And so I took those lessons with me to New York. I used them primarily in comedy, and when I got to Comedy Central, when Ha merged with the Comedy Channel and we launched Comedy Central, a big part of my job was to find ways to use news and pop culture for quick turnaround comedy pieces. Comedy Central was struggling at that time. There was a lot of resistance in the cable business to letting the channel sort of establish itself. And so what we were trying to do then was get noticed outside of TV, like not to just be a TV network, but to become something bigger in the culture. And so what I did there was I initiated the idea of using politics and news as a basis for comedy. And so I worked with people like Penn and Teller. I worked with Al Franken and Dennis Miller on some of the early political coverage that ended up sort of rolling into what's now The Daily Show and the Larry Wilmore, became the Colbert Report, and now Larry Wilmore, the political franchise that Comedy Central built. One of the things that I was proudest of was we made a 5-minute movie of the Tanya Harding, the Nancy Kerrigan story that we called Spunk, the Tanya Harding story, and it starred Teeny Others of TV's Family Ties. So that's what I did at Comedy Central. I was at Comedy Central for 6 or 7 years, and then I moved into animation and kids TV and other kinds of production in around New York. And about 10 years after I left Comedy Central, my boss, the guy who'd been the head of programming there, called me. He was developing some programming for CNN, and he asked if I'd be interested to come in and work with him. The challenge that he had been given at that time was to take a CNN primetime program and make it more of a talk show than a news show. So that was my introduction to CNN, and it didn't work. I came in late in 2007. It was right on the cusp of what became one of the most exciting Democratic primary elections in history, the sort of Barack Obama versus Hillary Clinton slugfest in 2008. And so the network really pulled in all the kind of out-of-the-box programming ideas that it was working on at that time, and just focused very directly on politics and more traditional news, what they called at that time minding their knitting. But I was there, and I really loved working there, and I really wanted to continue working there. So I was lucky enough to work with people who were willing to accommodate the fact that I had non-traditional training and non-traditional experience, you know, who sort of looked on that actually as an advantage, and it was an opportunity for me to move from comedy into news and to really start producing news programming with some wonderful people. So the way that I was able to do that was to use what I learned in comedy and at Second City as a news producer. That was the unique thing that I brought to the table. That was the unique thing that people responded to, and so that's kind of what I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. I'm going to show you a piece that I did in 2012 with Christiane Amanpour. She's the Chief Global Affairs correspondent. At the time, she was the Chief Global Affairs correspondent for CNN. I was working with a program for her on CNN International, and this is a little biographical piece about Recep Erdogan, who's the president of Turkey. Oop, hang on.
Erdogan's populist politics are rooted firmly in Istanbul's working-class Kasim Pasha neighborhood, where he built a loyal following among conservative religious voters in this Muslim land. But Turkey's adamantly secular military establishment feared his growing influence. When Erdogan was Istanbul's mayor, he was jailed for reading a poem that celebrated Turkey's Islamic culture, although it was written by one of the country's leading secular writers. Erdogan was promptly charged with incitement of religious hatred and served 4 months in prison. Afterwards, he formed the Justice and Development Party and was elected Prime Minister 10 years ago.
Devletin varlığı ve bağımsızlığını.
Since then, he has forged Turkey on a path not towards fundamentalism, but to a stronger and secular democracy, whose economy has been outperforming crisis-hit Europe and much of the rest of the world too. But now, in his third term, there are complaints that Erdogan is growing increasingly authoritarian as journalists are jailed and political opposition suppressed. Hello, Prime Minister. How are you? Thank you. And he tells me he is not ruling out the growing speculation that he does want to run for president when his term as Prime Minister ends, looking to give that office more executive power by making changes to the Constitution.
So, all right, that's a little bit esoteric, I guess, but that was 3 years ago. That was 2012. And since then, you know, Turkey's neighbor Syria blew up. ISIS became established. ISIS has grown through Syria and Iraq, another neighbor of Turkey's. And this guy, Recep Erdogan, is critical to how all of that has developed, how we're fighting it, whether we can fight it. He's a pivotal character. And what we tried to catch in that piece was the contradictions in his character. He's a brilliant politician, but he's also potentially a demagogue and potentially a very destructive politician. He did an amazing job building Turkey as a world economic power, but he's, in trying to hold on to power now, he's bringing Turkey further into a conservative Islamic direction that's polarizing a lot of the country and having a really difficult effect on, at home domestically. So it's all about his character, and if you'll indulge me, so is improvisation. I mean, when you do improvisation, when you're developing comedy through improvisation, it all, particularly the way that we did it at Second City. Sorry. Should I help? Yeah. Hi. It's my son, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't intend to improvise, but sometimes that's life. In improv, you start with the character, you start with contradictions, you start with trying to understand who your character is, how he or she sees the world, he or she, why they do, what their blind spots are, what their strengths are. And so in looking at news stories as they develop a narrative. I mean, a lot of times we're criticized for imposing a narrative, but a lot of times it's just there. And in something like this where so much is at stake, the personalities are so central, it really helps to understand what questions to ask when you're trying to analyze who these people are who are, shaping our destiny and why they do what they do and where they might go. The next thing that I want to show you is a little bit more recent. This is the program that I'm working on now. The show is called Reliable Sources. It's hosted by a young man named Brian Stelter. That's him there. And this is a weekly media show on CNN on Sundays, and sort of the goal of the show is to talk about what and why. What cable news covers, how it covers it, how it makes the decisions that it makes, why it does what it does.
Since Catherine Steinle was murdered on July 1st, the circumstances of her murder have, I'm sorry to say, become a political football. She was killed by an illegal immigrant, one who had a long felony history. And she was killed in San Francisco, a so-called sanctuary city where immigrants are sheltered from federal law enforcement. Not surprisingly, Fox News has covered this story very aggressively, blanketing its channel with images of Steinle and her alleged killer, and placing the blame for her death in liberals' laps. And it's not just Fox News. Her murder became Exhibit A in Donald Trump's, comments about illegal immigration, to the point where the victim's brother, Brad Steinle, said this to Anderson Cooper.
If you're gonna use somebody's name and you're gonna sensationalize the death of a beautiful young lady, maybe you should call and talk to the family first and see what their views are, and go from there.
Bill O'Reilly has been the main Fox News anchor focusing on this story, and he's not backing down. He's openly advocating for a new law, Kate's Law, and he sent a Fox News crew to ambush San Francisco's city supervisors right inside City Hall. Look what happened here.
Supervisor, we don't want to be a pest, but just literally a minute would be great.
Fox News is not real news, and you're not a reporter. I talk to real news only. Fox News is not real news.
We want to know if you showed remorse. Are you upset that the president didn't reach out to the families?
Fox News is not real news.
What a pinhead.
Scott Wiener is the city supervisor we saw in that clip. Scott, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
How does it feel to be called a pinhead by Bill O'Reilly?
Well, I've been called many worse things in my political career, but anytime Fox News is attacking you, you must be doing something right.
That was a story that I really wanted to do. I reached out to Scott Wiener and got him on the show, and here's why. Bill O'Reilly can be a bully. He's got this huge platform. They have an audience which is about 5 times the size of CNN's audience during prime time, and about 10 times the size of MSNBC's. And O'Reilly was beating the drum hard on this story. He's, trying to get legislation passed through Congress about this sanctuary city thing. And Scott Wiener stood up to him. And by pointing out that Fox News is not real news, which you guys laughed at, and it was very brave of him in a way to turn to their camera and say that. It was sort of an Emperor's New Clothes moment where he pointed out the transparency of what it was that O'Reilly and Fox were doing. So that's a news thing, but it's also a comedy thing. The pinhead won. And when you think about Charlie Chaplin or Bugs Bunny or even like Seth Rogen and some of the Judd Apatow movies, when the underdog wins, it's very gratifying. And if you can take those sort of comedy storytelling techniques into news, it makes for a more compelling story. So I have one more clip to show. This is a little bit long. I apologize for it. There's a bad edit in the middle because it was way long, and I cut it down a little bit. I was working with Chris Hayes at MSNBC on a weekend show that he did, and this was in 2011. This was before the last presidential election, and the Citizens United decision, the impact of sort of unregulated private money coming into the political system was just starting to be felt, and kind of, even though everyone knew it was coming, no one knew what it was going to do, and this is when we first started seeing what the impact was going to be.
My story of the week, democracy for billionaires. All right, just a few weeks before the South Carolina primary, not only was Newt Gingrich lagging in the polls, he didn't have the resources to compete with the deep-pocketed Mitt Romney. But then came Sheldon Adelson to the rescue. The multi-billionaire casino owner, right-wing donor, and personal friend of Gingrich gave his associated super PAC a whopping $5 million, which it then used to run a series of devastatingly effective attack ads against Romney's record at Bain Capital. This week, we learned that Adelson was doubling down on his investment in Gingrich, with Adelson's wife staking the former speaker's super PAC another $5 million to make him competitive in Florida. I don't happen to think Newt Gingrich is going to be our next president. In fact, I don't think he'll be the nominee. But in the highly unlikely chance he did make it to office, he would move into the West Wing with a direct and personal debt to a lone billionaire unmatched in recent memory. And if this is going to be what politics looks like in the second Gilded Age, it seems altogether important and proper to ask, just who is Sheldon Adelson? In 2008, The New Yorker published a definitive, jaw-dropping 12,500-word profile of the man. Adelson is a huge Republican donor with a history of suing journalists. His fortune comes from his ownership of casinos, including the Venetian in Las Vegas. His most lucrative idea was that Vegas could be a destination for business travelers and trade conventions. But the lion's share of his company's profits come from the casinos he owns in Asia, including several on the Chinese island of Macau. Adelson was granted an extremely rare and lucrative gambling license by the Chinese state, which is more or less a license to print money. According to Adelson's own testimony in a civil suit bought by Hong Kong middleman Richard Suen, Beijing's mayor asked Adelson for help with a resolution pending in Congress that opposed China's Olympic bid on the grounds of its, quote, abominable human rights record. The president of Adelson's company, Bill Widener, told the court that Adelson made an immediate phone call to then Congressman Tom DeLay, called him back 3 hours later to say the legislation was off the agenda. Adelson was then able to tell the Beijing mayor, quote, the bill will never see the light of day, don't worry about it. DeLay's spokesperson told a reporter he doesn't recall the conversation and had no role in blocking the bill. Nevertheless, Adelson got the license and edged out bigger casino developers. Today, his net worth is $21.5 billion. This is the heroic John Galt job creator at work, working his influence with the politicians he funds to protect the reputation of the Chinese regime so that they will grant him a state license for gambling that will make him billions of dollars. If that's not the American dream at work, I don't know what is. Now, whether or not Gingrich comes by his dangerous and morally bankrupt policy views honestly, or whether he views them as a strategic means of keeping Adelson's checks coming, the point here is less Gingrich and Adelson than the new frontier they are forging together. The complete and total breakdown of our campaign finance system, combined with the explosion of inequality, means that such a pairing was inevitable and is likely to grow more common in the future. Think about it for a second. If you were a multi-billionaire, Adelson is worth over $20 billion, how much would you be willing to spend to own the President of the United States? According to Forbes, the $10 million Adelson dropped on Gingrich is what his biggest hotel casino, the Marina Bay Sands, can make in profit in one day. What if he decided to really go for it and gave Gingrich's super PAC $100 million? In fact, it's a testament to the power of the status quo and the force of norms that this campaign hasn't already become a protracted proxy battle between billionaires. For all the talk of horse race coverage of presidential campaigns, perhaps the future presidential elections will be like actual horse races. Billionaires choose their candidates of choice and hire jockeys, that is campaign staffs and operatives, to ride them. We'll even have an active betting market on the outcome among the masses who watch the wealthy race their playthings. That's a dystopic vision. But if things don't change, that may be where we head. We'll have more Mr. Adelson right after this.
Yeah. So how many of you heard of Sheldon Adelson, by the way, just out of curiosity? So he's pretty well known now. At the time, he really wasn't. And he was one of 3 or 4 very wealthy people who really had an impact on the Republican primary in 2012. Will it happen again? Well, yeah. I mean, the people are sort of preparing for that. It's just so far the race has been so unpredictable that this hasn't been a big factor yet, but you see it coming. You sort of see it in the wings. So I had another director at Second City, this guy named Sheldon Patenkin, who was one of the founders of the theater, Mandy Patinkin's uncle. And his big sort of guiding principle was find the irony. That in any story you come to the point where the way things actually work and the way that you think things should work aren't the same. And that's been the principle that I've relied on most heavily in pulling together stories, producing stories, writing and presenting them, because that's the nub of it. That, I mean, in comedy it's funny, in news it can be tragic, but that point where why is this not working the way it should be working is really what any good news program or good news story is about. So I guess we're going to do a Q&A if anybody has any questions, but just sort of to quickly wrap up. If you want to be a journalist, go to journalism school. This is hard-earned and I think valuable advice. But in any creative profession, you bring everything you've ever done to whatever it is that you're doing. I think that's true of any profession, but particularly of creative and media professions. And that's what makes what you do distinctive and interesting. So, follow your instincts, follow your interests, pay attention, be a good human, do your homework, and the rest of it will kind of fall into place.
So we'll do we'll open the floor up for some questions. So does anyone have any questions? If you can.
When you're using news clips, is it copyright free? Like if it's for the news or if it's for comedy, can you use other news clips from other?
That's a complicated question. The yes and no. The no is that MSNBC is owned by NBC Universal, which is owned by Comcast, which is a giant cable company. CNN is owned by Time Warner. Fox is owned by, the Fox Corporation, 20th Century Fox. So they're very protective of their content. And, showing these clips tonight, I didn't get permission. In this context, I think it's okay to use them, but they are protective of their content. But in news and in comedy, there are laws that are called fair use laws, which is that you can take media content that's publicly distributed and use it for what it is that you're doing. You have to be very careful how you do it. You do it, I'm speaking for news now, but it's also true in comedy. You have to write to it. You have to be very specific about how you use it. You can't use it to promote what it is that you're doing. You can only use it in the context of what you're doing. But, if Donald Trump is on O'Reilly and he talks about, blocking the Muslims from coming into the country, we can show that clip with credit to Fox News under the fair use guidelines.
So I guess a follow-up question, because this is brick and you're not really making money out of it. Is it fair? Is it fair use? Can we use it?
It's not fair use
for comedy or news.
It's not fair use based on revenue. It's not fair use based on distribution. It's fair use based on, why you're using the content and how you're using it. You can't use it to promote yourself. You can't use it to, for your own product. You can only use it if your own product is commenting on that content in a constructive way. Oh. So, is Time Warner going to come after you? Probably not. But every once in a while you hear, stories of daycare centers that paint Disney characters on the walls and get cease and desist letters from Disney because they own the characters. It just, the people are very proprietary about their content.
Thank you very much.
Do you ever worry that your personal point of view has too much influence on your content, the way you present it? Or do you try to be objective, or do you not care about that?
That's a really good question. Clearly, I have a point of view. But, one thing that's sort of a general, another kind of media point is I'm not doing this for myself. I'm generally working for a host. You saw Christiana Amanpour, you saw Chris Hayes, you saw Brian Stelter. I'm working in service of their point of view. But beyond that, it depends on the network and it depends on the context. Some of what MSNBC was doing was more commentary. Some of it was straight news. When you're doing straight news, you do have to be objective. And you do have to be balanced. And I think it's okay to have a point of view. I think every producer should have a point of view. But I think you should be aware of your own point of views and look for opportunities to diversify what it is that you're communicating so that you're not constantly falling into one voice, one point of view.
Oh, my question is very simple.
What, 17 across?
Yeah. I wonder how come, because I understand that the purpose of the news is to inform, right? Not to entertain. How come the news right now has evolved from inform to comedy or to entertain the people?
The news hasn't really evolved to comedy and entertainment. It needs to be engaging. And some programs, some networks, some presenters are more conscious of, being compelling, but they aren't trying to entertain. On the other hand, shows like The Daily Show and The Nightly Show, and even now, Stephen Colbert at CBS on the Late Show, they're very informative. John Oliver on HBO, they're very informative. They're not news shows, but they're smart, well-informed people with a lot of curiosity about the world who are willing to dig deep and try to figure out what's happening and why. And you can get a lot of really good information content from non-news shows.
Yeah, I think they have a clue for that. And the clue is the money.
I'm sorry, say it again?
That the clue that the news have changed to entertain or comedy is the money thing, because the news doesn't produce any money.
News produces a lot of money, actually. It's a pretty lucrative, CNN is a pretty lucrative franchise. And it is a business, but it's a journalistic business, and it's run with very well articulated standards about, objectivity and how it presents the news.
My question is, how do you land, what's the secret to landing your first job in media when you're out of college and you apply and the qualification is always 1 to 2 years, but you got to start somewhere and all you have is a college degree in journalism, media arts, film and television when you want to be your long-term goals, but you have to start here. And media, we know, is an industry of who you know, but it's still very, very, very hard.
There's no magic answer. And I'm living proof of that. I mean, I really would advise you not to do what I did. But there's no magic answer. And who you know is important. So how do you meet people? That's why internships and other educational, experiences that you have in the course of your education are important. If you're in journalism school, or if you're working on your school paper, or doing something related to journalism or media in school, you'll have mentors who can be very important to helping introduce you to people or helping guide you or direct you to where you might be able to end up professionally or start out professionally. Internships are really important. A lot of the people that I work with are people who came into these various networks as interns and met people and forged relationships with some of the professionals there, and that was their entree. But the other thing that I would say is that what you do is easily as important as who you know, that we live in a time when it's really easy to get your work distributed. There are no gatekeepers anymore. It's easy to get your stuff up and where people can see it. And you should use that as much as you can. Put as much work that represents who you are out there that you can show people that as sort of proof that you can do the work that you're asking them to hire you to do. And the more that you can do that, the more that you can establish a record for yourself, even on your own resources. And you can do that. I think it's helpful and smart to do.
Question. So when you're approaching a story, what's your process? How do you iterate a story from inception to what we see on TV?
Thank you. It's a good question. A lot of, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I'm going back to the improv thing, because what you do in improvisation is you take it all in, and then you kind of let it go. And once it's in there, you can sort of process it, and it comes out as you need it to. So when I'm working with, Chris Hayes or Brian Stelter, a lot of what I do with them is kind of make sure that they're pretty well informed on what it is that we're doing a story on, that they've seen different sides of it, that they know, this, Donald Trump sees it this way, but, Marco Rubio sees it that way. Establishment, Republican National Committee leaders have a whole different take, and then the Democrats are, in a completely different place altogether. Here's where they're coming from. Here's why. Make it digestible. Make it so that he can process it, put it together. And then when he sort of has a concept of where he wants to go with the story, then it's a question of finding the media elements that support the way he wants to tell the story. So, the clips of people talking, the graphs that demonstrate, data that's important to a story, quotes from other media that illuminate the story. All of that I sort of put together with an eye towards helping the presenter tell the story they want to tell.
My question is, do you think that technology is helping or hindering news? And do you think that stations will eventually become obsolete?
Do you think technology is helping or hindering news?
It's a 50-50. It really depends. I think it's good. Like if there is, let's just say, I think it was 2 months ago, there was a fire in the city. And a lot of people took their cell phones out, and they ended up, kind of filming it, and news stations were using that if, of course, the news station itself wasn't able to get there. But I don't know. It's a 50-50 for me. But I do kind of feel that potentially that it will become obsolete. So
it's a really good question. It's obviously the $1 million question after how do you get your first job. My sort of off-the-cuff answer is that it's like fire. It can keep you warm in the winter, but it can also burn down your house. These are very powerful tools now that we have access to. On the one hand, you get rumors and false information just running rampant. You get, this bothers journalists, but you'll see pictures of people protesting after the Charlie Hebdo massacres as though they're protesting after the subsequent terrorist attack in France 8 months later. There's no way to know the provenance of what you're distributing digitally, and a lot of information that you see there is wrong. On the other hand, there's hardly any journalists in Syria. When they do go in, they go in for a week or two at most and get right back out again, hopefully. So, it's kind of and it's one of the most important stories in the world right now, and we're not getting major media companies covering it. So what we're getting is citizen journalists, people with cell phones who are brave enough to document and distribute what they're seeing, which is really extraordinary when you think about it, because people are risking their lives to take cell phone videos of stuff that's happening in like Raqqa, where ISIS is. Some of that is propaganda. Some of that is unreliable. Some of that is sent out as distortion to confuse us about what's going on. Some of it is brave people risking their lives to tell us, you guys, this is what's happening. And there's a whole industry of people who've grown up who look at that stuff and vet it and evaluate it and determine what may or may not have value. And the reason you're seeing a lot more digital material and user-generated material on cable news now is because we're getting better at figuring out what's reliable and what isn't. And it's become a really critical part of news gathering. That said, the big media companies with the resources to gather news from all over the world and broadcast it all over the world 24 hours a day, those are big billion-dollar businesses. There's not a lot of them out there, and the guy with a cell phone camera in Raqqa can't do that. So there's going to be a balance between the person on the ground with the cell phone and the big media company, in New York that with global reach. And I don't know how it's going to shake out, but there's a role for both of them.
In terms of CNN's programming, it seems like now you have Anthony Bourdain, which is sort of a food show, and then you have other shows. What is it? What's CNN's programming? gonna look like in the next few years, or what is it looking for?
It's a really good question. The Anthony Bourdain and Lisa Ling and Morgan Spurlock and the Dirty Job of Someone's Got to Do It guy, whose name I'm forgetting right now. Mike Rowe, thank you. They came in sort of to solve a problem that CNN was having, which is that not enough people were watching CNN. And they've been pretty successful. They've expanded the audience in prime time, and there's sort of been a halo effect for Erin Burnett, Anderson Cooper, Don Lemon. More people are watching those more traditional news shows now, partly on the basis of these kind of 9 o'clock, more documentary, real-world kind of programming that the network brought in. They're doing it because they kind of had to do it. You know, the whole thing with Bill O'Reilly and the soapbox that he has is that, you know, if 5 million people are watching him in the course of an evening, 1 million are watching CNN. That's 20% of O'Reilly's audience. And it was falling. So these shows helped pull people back into what is still CNN's core business, which is what happened today and what should I think about it.
Okay, do you think that Fox News is real news? And do you think that media networks tend to sensationalize things just for ratings?
Okay. I'm answering as myself now. No, I don't think Fox News is real news. I think there is some real news on Fox News, but I think that it's a network that is much of what they do is they figure out the narrative, and then they find the stories that reinforce that narrative. So the perfect example of that is the war on Christmas. I don't think there's a war on Christmas. And I don't think that people saying happy holidays to each other in any way invalidates the Christian experience. But for 10 years, at this time of year, they've gone all in on that. And there are some people who are really angry about the war on Christmas. So, no. On the other hand, you know, Brett Baer and Shepard Smith and Chris Wallace have done some really important interviews that have really illuminated some, you know, newsmakers and key issues. So there's valuable content coming out of Fox, but I don't think their mission primarily is what you would consider a news network. What was the second question?
Do you think that media networks sensationalize for ratings?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's been a really interesting thing about being inside the cable networks. So I'm just making this up, but let's say 1,000 things happen in the world on any given day. Let's say 500 things happen in the United States on any given day. Let's say there's good reasons for you to know about 100 of them. 2 of them you're going to talk about tomorrow. Guess which ones are going to be at the top of the show? You know, a lot of thought is given to what's going to compel people to watch, what's going to compel people to talk about what we show, what's going to compel people to come back and watch it some more. And Donald Trump is the perfect example. I mean, he's just great TV, and he hasn't disappointed yet. And you know, as long as he's compelling to watch, he's going to continue to lead on cable news. And this is what's good about working on a media show. He's gotten twice the coverage of anyone else. He alone has gotten twice the coverage of everybody else, if not more. And it's because he's incredibly compelling. And sometimes the news is like watching a football game. It's fun watching live events on TV because you don't know how they're going to end. And yes, we do program to that. There's someone in the back.
Well, I'm listening to everything centering around certain stations, and I'm wondering, along with the question about all this new availability to people, is there any kind of platform that's developing where new TV stations can come up? Because these same stations have to go through the same filtering process, the same censoring process before it hits the air, you know, like Reuters and with that other one, but there's other viewpoints that just are being totally overlooked. And is there, with all these thousands of stations that are available on cable, is there a means that other viewpoints can, solidify and come up to the point of being as available? Is there something that we could do?
Yeah. Just quickly before I answer, Sky, are we okay for time? I mean, how?
Yeah, we have maybe time for 2 more questions.
Okay. The short answer is that the next influential TV networks won't be on TV, and we're already seeing that. We're seeing a lot of data journalism, companies like Vox and The Intercept. We're seeing companies like Vice and BuzzFeed go into news and make a real contribution. The reason that Comedy Central and Ha struggled to launch was because they needed cable operators to say, we will pay you for your programming. And I was there when they went from being distributed into 10 million homes to being distributed in about 60 million homes. They're probably in about 100 or 110 million homes now. That business is not the business anymore. That was 20 years ago. That's not now. Now it is about convergent content. It is about digital distribution, and different points of view have a much better opportunity now to have an impact than they ever have before. The challenge is you got to be able to find them. The best way to find them is if people on those alternative platforms are saying something that you want to hear. So if the content is worthwhile and meaningful, it will find an audience. And if the content is really compelling, it could find a big audience. So there is a lot of diverse content now. If I want to know, let's stay in news. If I want to know what, Europe is thinking about the attacks in San Bernardino and the U.S. response, I can find out. If I want to know how the Muslim American community is responding to the attacks in San Bernardino and the political response, I can find out. There are sources where people with very specific voices have an opportunity to express themselves, and we can all find them. So yeah, I mean it's not about being channel 713 on your cable dial anymore. It's about being compelling enough that I can do your www and find you. They ran out of cord.
As a writer, I have 2 questions for you. I'm curious to know, how do you do freelance work for news networks, if you said that? And the second is, when we see or hear Chris Hayes or Amon Poor speak with such authority, how much of that is really your words? And do you ever conflict with these people about what they're going to be saying on air?
Those are all good questions. It's not easy to be a freelancer in news. The way to, it's almost kind of a similar answer to how you get your first job. The way you get to be a freelancer in news is by being a freelancer in news. So there is a little bit of a catch-22. You need to sort of establish yourself with work in that area, that someone can look at and say, yeah, I could see working with them. So, if you're doing print journalism, if you're doing digital journalism, or if you're doing some sort of, maybe not journalism, but another kind of media that has real world content that you can sort of connect with people and say, hey, I can do that, then that's kind of what you need to do. In terms of, me as a writer and those guys as authorities, I defer to them. The thing with Christiane, just using her as an example, Chris Hayes and Brian Stelter each have their own version of this, and the other people I've worked with all have their own version of this. But Christiane is an example. Christiane Amanpour is an example. She's been doing this for 25 years. She's 30 years. She was in, Bosnia when, when NATO bombs were coming down. She knows the dynamics. She knows, why Robert Mugabe has been in office for 30 years. She knows why, Putin can come in and take the Crimea without pushback from NATO. She's been doing this long enough that she has a record in her head of where these stories fall and where they might be going based on what she's seen before. So it starts with her. What I'd like to do with her, and this is where my opportunity to express myself comes in, is to say, but did you think of it this way? Or, that's kind of a conventional take. There are people who are making a pretty good argument about this. And that's when the fun starts. Because as you sort of see stuff come in and get processed in her head, and there's everyone who's doing what I do has different versions of this story, but it's almost like the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's like, no, that's not right. To okay, I can see that. That process helps her. Figure out her take on the story, her direction, and how she wants to cover it. So that's where that role can become really, really helpful.
Okay, I think we have time for one more.
Hi. 2 quick questions. Is this a true statement that the truth is what the people will believe? And how much of the news is propaganda? I believe it's 97%, but
I can't answer either of those. I don't know if the truth is what people will believe, and I don't know if that's bad necessarily. If our job is to convince you, I don't think so. I'm not that cynical. I think there are objective truths that we can figure out. I also think there's not 2 sides to every story. I think that's a mistake that TV news makes too often, is to say, here's one guy, here's one person, here's another person, and they represent the full spectrum of a story. I don't think that's true. But I do think that there are objective truths, and we can find them and report them. In terms of propaganda, I don't think so. I think what is propaganda? Propaganda is content that's skewed to push you into a direction, to push your thoughts and beliefs into a direction they may not otherwise go. I don't think that's what by and large cable news is doing. I think that we're trying to present a somewhat rounded take on what's going on and let you decide for yourself. There are times when they fall into that. I think that in the run-up to the Iraq War, there were problems with TV news and journalism more broadly not being reflective enough about what it was that they were saying and why they were saying it. So we're human, but I don't think it's the goal.
All right, well, thank you very much, Ken. Let's give him a round of applause. Really appreciate it.